a
Pizza's
little
not
chart
chocolate.
there that brings out, I'm sorry, I forgot your name?
Tom.
What Tom said in Matthew 25. There's a passage where Jesus is depicting the final judgment, you know? And he says, okay, sheep over here, goats over here. And here's the description. Here's what matters. And it's like, when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was sick, you cared for me. When I was in jail, you visited me. You know, when I was naked, you clothed me. When I needed shelter, you sheltered me. Very practical stuff. Jesus didn't say, when I, the triune God, required this and that sacrifice, or wanted this and that worship, you sang your songs wrong, or something like that. That's not what's going on here. It is clearly what we now call the church's social mission. It's taking care of people in need. And what does that require? First of all, seeing those people in need. And then the response that's really getting us there, getting us to where we do that. And the thing is, that when we turn to the goats, this is going to be a strong phrase, but it's what he says. He says, you go to hell, because you didn't do that for me. They're worse than useless, because we didn't do it. You know?
How do you reconcile that with like Matthew 26:11, which says the poor will always be here?
And that is true, and it's the only time he talked like that. And why did he say that?
Because he was here now, and he was comparing it. Poor's here right now, concentrate on me.
What he was doing is he was being challenged about accepting the care of another person, a woman. He was being challenged for accepting care. It is a statement that lets us know we have plenty to work with. But it isn't a way of saying, don't worry about the poor. That's not what he was saying at all.
Yeah,
He was answering somebody who challenged him about accepting care. And I think that's something we have to learn from too.
yeah.
If we think we should never accept the care, or never need the care, then we're off base.
You have to have that balance, right? I mean, if you can't care for yourself, and then kind of like a people that become the destruction, you become destruction as well.
Well, what we're talking about right now is exactly what we're going to talk about now, and I'm going to do it in a way that's a little bit systematic. And that is, the church had to develop wisdom about how to do this, because actually what you have right there can sound very cut and dried. But how do you do it in the everyday?
How'd they do
So-
the Acts of the Apostles when the church started?
Exactly. And what did it mean? Why could they do things like say, everybody brought their goods to the apostles, laid them at the apostles' feet, and the apostles distributed them according to need? How's that sustainable?
Yeah.
They thought Jesus was returning right back. Already, within the early parts of Jesus' followers, you see the thing, we've got to deal with the fact that Jesus didn't return like in 2 weeks, you know, or 2 months, or 2 years. And it is true, we don't know when he's coming back, so now what do we do? By the way, culturally in that time, what we call private property today, that was not as prevalent. It was there, and even from, you know, the times of the Old Testament, they were trying to do things like the meaning of the Jubilee year, when you return property to families and stuff, and in the in-between years you use it as, you know, there's all kinds of business dealings about how you use that property, but in the Jubilee year it returns, it's established, it belongs to the family that originally had it and all that. There's all kinds of things that are examples of we have to see how we do this and do it wisely and do it into the future. So that's what we're going to be talking about now. And so we have the situation where right up front in the early, first few centuries, you had people who, some were saying private property is sinful and communal living is where it's at. And then you had other people saying, no, private property has its place. And we've got to figure out what it means to be responsible for that within the context of the larger community. So they had systems that we don't have today about how things get dealt with. So we can't see things only through the eyes of how things are dealt with today. You have to take the historical reality and their thing, what they were dealing with, and bring it forward. So one of the very first things is, how do you take care of everybody in this community? And you have James saying right off the bat, look, what are you doing getting together in your house church? I'm paraphrasing here. And you welcome with great, pomp and circumstance the wealthy member of the community, and when the poor member of the community walks in, he can sit over there. And, sir, so it's like they're dealing with that right up front. And they're also dealing with how did deaconship get going? They're dealing with the whole thing of what about the distribution of what the widows need? And to be sure that some, really get what, here it is. Other widows are being dismissed totally, and oh, by the way, that's an ethnicity thing. Oh dear. They have to work through all of that. That part I think seems a little obvious to us today. Not good to say, if you're this ethnicity, you don't get anything. You're this ethnicity, you get that, you get it all. It's like, we know better than that today, but they actually had to work through that. Well, we have our things to work through too, but let's take a walk through wisdom. So again, we're going to clip through 2,000 years here, between now and 1130, okay? So thank you for your patience in the time travel. I did want you to have that little card and then a chocolate so you have a little rev for the journey. We have the struggles in the early church about how do you be charitable? What is and that's based on identity. How do you have communities? Paul crashes straight through and keeps going, straight through an awful lot. That he himself had been killing people in order to enforce previously. So the very things that he staked his life and other people's lives on, he crashes right through and keeps going. And he's really clear that if you're blessed at the time, you share what you have with others. And he gets it not only within just the community that you're face to face with, he does the original church collection, going through, picking up donations to take to the community that's suffering in Jerusalem, or the community that's suffering over here. You guys are well off, let's share. And they trust him. They trust him with their goods. Why? Because he's already broken all the other barriers. He's broken all the social barriers. He's broken all the barriers that people use to keep their identity intact, is how they first see it. But Jesus, that's exactly what Jesus had done. Jesus broke barrier after barrier, not just for the sake of breaking barriers, but always for the sake of focusing on the other. And that's who his followers become. They too were boundary breakers, not for the sake of boundary breaking, but for the sake of focusing on those most in need. And they go forward with that. And so you have St. John Chrysostom, within the first few centuries, saying things like, yeah, private property is sinful. In his context, that made more sense than it would in our context today. But what he was saying isn't just that. He was saying, you've got to serve those most in need. Another thing, how dare you put gold on your altars when your brother is starving? That's another thing he said. As they get together, their way of worshiping, and they're establishing that. They're establishing ways of worshiping. He intervenes always on the side of the poor. Always. And he's known for that. But he is so compelling that they call him Golden Mouth. He drew so many people to the church through that. He wasn't the only one. The supreme draw of the early church was that it reached out to the poor. And so a lot of the early church was poor people. They wanted to be in a community where they were seen.
I'm just curious, do you see that as not a draw today?
I think that several things. I think one is that in the extreme delicate initial steps of the early church, it was a really, you might say, really weird thing. For getting past all those very difficult initial steps, you use vulnerability and poverty. That is really saying something. And I think that's why it was such a strong signal in the midst of people being persecuted, being thrown to lions, being beheaded, being crucified up and down ways. You know, it's like all of that stuff. I mean, the results of choosing that vulnerability were extreme. So it was more, to me, it was more extreme in the early church. And that was, ironically enough, the strength of its establishment. It got off the ground really strongly because that's how they chose, that they went that direction. Now, here today, do I think we do that today, or that it's not the same witness today? I don't think it is. I think there are a lot of people, well, I know a lot of people, who are just like, you just hand out people and that's, you know, so to the extent I think handouts are good, that's where I see you. And that's, number one, it's a misconception, and we'll be talking about that. But number two, it's like, yeah, it's a way to marginalize Catholics and Christians. Yeah. So that's always interesting though. What do we do with that and how do we go forward with that? Because at the same time, there are a lot of people who say, you know, for example, CRS, right? CRS is known as, we're the ones who get it right. And other nonprofits, international nonprofits, are turning to us because we got it right. How are we getting it right so fast? It's because of the church's principles. Yeah. And they've changed in my lifetime. So it's an adventure in the making, but we've got the wisdom, we've got the boundaries broken, we're worldwide, so that gives us a whole lot of buildup of wisdom from a number of quarters, and through time, we've got 2,000 years worth of wisdom. So it's like, we have a lot of advantages for being able to live this. However, in the US in particular, that is such an unknown that we're hidden. And that whole thing about be the light on the hill as your salt of the earth, I mean, you know, those two images together, they're meant to go together. Deal salt of the earth stuff and then you're the light on the hill. You know? And it's like, it's amazing, but we're not that light on the hill because we're hidden. And we'll talk about that. Yes?
Can you give us a stark example of how CRS gets it right and the other people's were getting it wrong?
Yes, well, I'm not going to focus on others getting it wrong. It will become apparent, okay? Let's walk you through
I'll help
that.
you with that one. United Way,
Okay, yes. There will be things, okay.
their CEO, or their director or whatever drives a Mercedes here.
Yeah.
That seems wrong.
Do you have an example?
Yeah, oh, I have tons, but we will get there. But let me walk us through, okay? And I'll be, but thank you. You know, I mean, your interest is there, and keep those questions in your head. And if between Michaeli and I, we don't get that answered, we are going to raise it again, right? So, but I think we're going to answer that along the way. So I'm going to be clipping through some wisdom building. So that early church claimed the focus on vulnerability and poverty. And it was their strength. And it is how they survived a lot. And of course, it was because of Jesus and their awareness of being Jesus in the world today. And the sharpness of that realization for them, that they're following Jesus and Jesus lives in them to make that happen. And their rituals were built to experience not only something intellectually, but actually experience Jesus in their midst. And those are the rituals we've inherited today. And so we have a community that is built from the very beginning, fraught with some stuff. They had to also really choose to break through basic boundaries. And so you have Acts 15 and the significance of that. So it's that they had to keep going with that boundary breaking that allowed them to become a universal church. And to be the people of God with a whole new sense, because it's now that's not a matter of you're a people because of geography. It's way beyond that. You're a people because of God. You're a people because of God within you, individually and in the community. And the insistence on experiencing that. And the beautiful, beautiful Eucharistic prayers that come from the church's very beginning. That's born out of their reality. And it was so intense, it holds for us today. The beauty of those prayers. And then you come forward and you hit a time in history where not only is the church not persecuted, it actually gets enshrined as the church, the state's religion. And therein we enter another whole period of our history as a church. We got to claim our full history. Because actually, in some ways that released the burden of persecution. I mean, it released us from the burden of persecution. And that burden, it fell off our backs fully, but largely. But it entered into a temptation to be the established religion of the state. And there's a certain danger in that for centuries the church dealt with. Because being an earthly power came with its own difficulties. And at that time, I mean, today we have a whole nation that got built on distinguishing between church and state. At that time, thinking was more monolithic, and that went together more fully. Now, Christianity was always a challenge to that, you might say. But in becoming established religion, that got fought over centuries in a way that was a little difficult for the church to deal with. Because actually, it seemed like a good thing to be the established religion of the state. But then you got splinters and difficulties, and it ends up going with the kings. Whichever flag flew over you said whether you were Catholic or Protestant. And meanwhile, in the lands where Christianity wasn't primary at all, and other flags flew, they were whole different religions there. So your flag determined your religion. Not totally, but that was the norm. And that's why people had humongous fights. And popes became territorial leaders and warriors and leaders of warriors and garners of wealth. That is part of our church history. It was thought the best way to establish a focus on Jesus Christ, that you got to force Jesus Christ down people's throats. And we did all kinds of things with that badly. And at the same time struggled, what do? And one of the, ironically, best things that happened to the church is when the church lost more and more of its physical territory. Until today, the Vatican is a nut. You know? And it is at service clearly at the universal church. The wars aren't about what's happening within what we now know as Italy. You know, for example, I'm just saying, for example.
So
And
you went from Constantine when we had the state church, and then throughout the next 1,000 years where all the different kings represented the religion and the government.
splits within religion itself, you know. Within Christendom, for example, the splits between Protestants and Catholics. But even before that, the splits between Catholicism and, say, Islam or Judaism.
Even Eastern or Western.
Yes, Eastern and Western, the whole thing. The splits are hitting, they're getting entrenched via religions. And in the meantime, that kind of thing becomes important instead of the focus on the poor, that, you know, it's like all of that. There was a struggle, now to say, monastic life, for example, had started happening way back early. And monastic life had its morphing through time, its development through time. But monastic life has remained all the way through, witness to communal life and a witness to being the light on the hill. Monastic life almost always was of service to the poor and the sick. The sick, I mean, they were prime doctors, right? But also the original understanding of what it would take to, say, be a priest or a bishop or a monk or a nun was access to education. And the nuns, not always, but you know, there were literate people. The word cleric really comes from able to write, because the passing on of the best of human wisdom and the best of human ways that needed to be done often through writing. It was done through individuals who were incredible, incredible. But any individual preacher dies. Any individual teacher dies. So you write things down and you pass things on through writing, thus the importance of reading and writing. And the church throwing some of its resources at being sure anybody who was in leadership in the church was literate. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
In a highly illiterate society. There had been some societies that remained, that chose literacy early on and chose broad literacy early on, but a lot didn't. And a lot of the hotbed of where Catholicism grew didn't. And that is one of the things that in a time of history became very important, and a decision that I thought was incredible. And most people don't think about it, but the invention of the printing press blew a lot. You know, it blew the lid right off a lot of ways to control people. So it was a question for power, for the sake of power, which most people want to hang on to. Do you actually let everybody learn how to read? You know, do you really want that going on? Think of the Catholic question. If we teach people to read, They interpret for themselves, and look at what we've got. We've got Protestants out here, precisely through that. And yet you had especially religious orders saying, we educate everybody because it empowers everybody. Now, they didn't use those words, but it was that sense that an educated populace is much more able to take care of itself. It's a way of breaking past the boundaries that clearly keep some people down. And again, now we would look back at things and call it social engineering, social engineering, social engineering. Things like slavery, social engineering. And yet today people don't see what we have socially engineered. The whole thing of, no, we won't have the minimum wage be living wage. That's a piece of social engineering that guarantees we've got a workforce we don't have to pay enough to live on. And we don't, so it's like social engineering has happened all the way through, and we have to see that through the eyes of faith. And begin, that's part of the wisdom the church has developed. So you have the church deciding at one point, especially through the religious orders, quite frankly, yes, we choose to educate people. It's part of their dignity. It's part of our understanding of what it means for them to be human. And then we have Pope Leo calling for workers' rights. That was social engineering, by the way. Because in calling for workers' rights, he was breaking the boundary of here's who gets what they need and here's who doesn't get what they need. And Pope Leo XIII was known as the beginning of the modern development of Catholic social teaching. Okay, are we all in Leo XIII realm now? Are we okay with?
Is this the same Leo XIII that did the St. Michael's prayer?
To tell you the truth, I don't know who did the St. Michael's prayer.
I think so.
I just don't, I'm sorry, do you know, Father?
No.
Okay, so anyway, but we have that sense, just as the industrial age gets started. So, by the way, are you noticing the church has to react to what's developing in a larger society? The Enlightenment had hit, and there was a change in society due to the Enlightenment, and the church came out on wondering where it should come down on in terms of the Enlightenment, because some people were using the whole development, human development, that we now treasure today, but some people were using it to say, jettison the church. Jettison all this stuff about faith in God. Jettison all this stuff about we worship the way we worship. And the church was plunged, whether she wanted to be or not, she was plunged into a lot of controversy about everything from fundamental ritual, hocus corpus meum, this is my body, becoming hocus pocus, a way of ridiculing the church's rituals, to the church's sign of care for the poor being, yeah, let the monasteries do that. Nobody else should have to. The monasteries, the religious orders in the meantime, are really out there developing education for everybody, healthcare for everybody, a sense of protecting and welcoming workers, sheltering those who are homeless. They were allowed to come into monasteries until they could get their life back together again. What we would call social work today, that was done in the monasteries. So you know what I mean? There was a haven all the way along, but did the church as a whole do that? Maybe, maybe not. It depended on, you have saints arising throughout all of this, right? You have Francis, one of the most beloved, I'm talking of Assisi now, okay, just now. One of the most beloved in the world through all time. And what was his big deal? It was associating with the poor. you know? And you had leaders who would stand up for the rights of the poor. You had Leo the 13th standing up for workers. Coming a little farther in, you have the Pope Pius during the Second World War, weaving his way between how do I protect these people and at the same time know that the Nazis can crush everything.
They love it with Mussolini.
Yeah,
You know, what
it's-
relationship was there?
what do you do? How do you thread that needle? Now, looking back on it, we've got all kinds of opinions about how that could happen. But at the time, I mean, think of your own life. And I do want to tie this back into, because it's all about human living, right? And if you think of yourself as a parent, or if you're not a parent, just even the treatment of your nieces and nephews or whoever, it's like, there are times you end up threading a needle because you don't know how this is going to play out. You know? Your kid wants to do X, and you're like, not yet, or never, as long as I'm here. You know, and it's like you thread that needle about how do you maintain the relationship as you hold a boundary that's important. And the reverse is also true. How do you help the kid break past stupid boundaries they're holding? Destructive boundaries they're holding? How do you help them do that? And, you know, it's like we, as human beings, anything that happens out there, you can probably find a personal parallel to in our own lives. And we know the difficulties we have in our own lives. And we can cut ourselves some slack because we know we don't know. Well, as communities, if we're highly, highly involved in a parish, we can generally learn to cut our community a little slack without letting it betray its nature. And the same with priests, the same in other circumstances. But as a worldwide church, I think what helps is claiming our church history, our church story, down through time. And then we know it's not easy, so we can look back on Pope Pius trying to thread that needle during World War II and say, yeah, parts of that he got wrong. Parts of it he got right. And parts of it, a lot of it that was good, people don't even know that he did because he had to keep it secret in order to pull it off. And it's like, what do we think of that? Well, let's think, you know, it's like whenever we judge something, I think we get to judge from a bigger space than they might have had to work in, for one thing. We're not nose to nose with that threat that they were.
Plus we have
But
the
at the
benefits of
same
the results.
Yes, we have the benefits of results.
That's 2020. I always contend, if I had the same situation again, whatever I do in life, if I had the same thing, want to do it over again, I'm going to want to do it over again based on what I know now,
Yeah,
but I would make the same decision then, because that's the data I had.
exactly,
That's the
exactly.
only data I had, and I did not make the wrong choice. I made the right choice.
At
It didn't
that
end up being the right result. But based on what I knew, and what I
Yeah.
was given, I had to make that choice.
Yeah. And quite
That's
frankly,
how
who we are at the time.
Yeah.
Because we've grown bigger, but we're not that big to begin with. We're not that big-minded, we're not that big-hearted. And we do understand that. And there again, it's like we turn, we make turns, you know, we choose. And those are the most important turning points. Those are the most important decisions in a journey. If there's a fork in the road and you go one way, and you realize, oh, but wait, I need to be over here. I made the wrong, well, go like this, you know? And we do that individually and as a community. So then we come into, and now I'm going to be talking about things that, if you're as old as me, you've lived through. I'm 67, so he may or may not, you know, be talking down this road. But what I remember, John the 23rd. And it was wonderful to be a young adult. No, I was a teen at the time. Old enough to understand what was, to some extent, what was going on, but too young to be responsible for any of it. That was delightful because it was a really sharp bed for learning. And he was dealing with the fact that we had just, the nation, the world, had been through a couple of world wars and had a bomb in its arms that it was too infantile to know how to deal with well. And thus comes peace on earth. And the incredible nature of bishops gathered in conclave, that a lot of them hadn't wanted to have heaven. And they're working things through, again, about how we worship. That instead of fulfilling a rite just so, by the way, your hands need to be this far apart from each other. No, what we are, love consecrates. We gather in order to experience together the mysteries that we actually hear about in scriptures and understand because now we're using the vernacular. So we're plunged into the deepest mysteries of Jesus and Mary and the life of the Spirit and a God who loves beyond all telling. And we sing and we gather as community because we have to experience that together in order for it to be real. And we know we're sent forth in order to make it real for more than just our community. We take it out into our world. And we get that down. And then one of the most beautiful, beautiful documents of the whole Vatican II, starting out, the joys, the hopes, the griefs, the anxieties of the people of God. Those are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the church as well. The church in the modern world. And it was a total pivot from being church to being church, church, church out there in the modern world. Our understanding of the church today is based on that pivot in many ways. And it just opened up the social mission of the church tremendously, from being in the hands of a few monks and nuns to being in the hands of the people of God. And by the way, that happens because of who we are. It's not a mandate that we have to go do now because we were told to. If we believe, if we experience the love of God, if we experience that love of God's that focused on us and constantly invites us to focus on the other, how can we not go out and serve? If we realize that we're not just following a bunch of rules and punching certain, items on a ticket in order to get to heaven, but that it is a life, it's got to be a life that focuses on the other. That's who we are. That's what we're about. And we gain wisdom in abundance once we turned our sights in that direction. It's wisdom that's developed through the ages, and again, I will always be grateful for religious orders that really honed a lot, and then when the church was ready, said, here it is. Here it is. Here's the wisdom we have so far. Keep going, keep getting wisdom. And we've done that. It's like, how do we focus on the other well? And so you have, and I'm clipping past things really quickly here, but you have Pope Benedict saying, look, we live in solidarity. And that's important. But let's be wise about it. There's a principle called subsidiarity as well. You have the principle of solidarity. You also have the principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity meaning, just a couple things I want to say about that. It means you in subsidiarity, you don't do for other people what they can do for themselves, because ultimately that is against their dignity. And the other thing is, when a decision is going to be made that's about them, it might be good to have them involved in the decision-making process. Yeah, it might be more accurate in how you solve this. And again, it's a matter of their dignity. So solidarity and subsidiarity must go together. Solidarity, this is Benedict, without subsidiarity, you run the risk of being patronizing. Subsidiarity without solidarity, you run the risk of being mechanical. So there's a lot of wisdom like that that the church has built up over time. And we have some that we're going to go through right now. Okay, are we together here?
Work together.
Yay. I'm going to hand out some, one of the things that happened was in the, I want to say 80s. It might have been 90s, but I think it was the 80s. The U.S. church was, we had a lot of education. We had a lot, you know, I mean, the U.S. has been well blessed in moving some things forward. Now the liturgy revival came out of France, maybe. You know, other places were better than we were about the development of liturgy. But boy, did we do pretty well about the movement on the church's social mission. And we were blessed with, let's get down some things that people can hang their hat on about this, some principles or some guidelines that everybody can hang their hat on about how to do this care in a way that is sustainable and in a way that really lets things happen well and that everybody's dignity is respected. And a priest named Brian Hare was the bishop's right-hand guy for pulling a lot together. And in the first go-round, it came up with about 48 principles. Well, nobody's going to be able to remember and have in mind that many. And distill it, and okay, 24. 24 is a bit much. Distill it. And by this time you have a number of people trying to distill it well in a way that is rich and at the same time handleable by everybody, not just by a few. And so the bishops, Brian here kept the writing going and came up with this, but the bishops adopted 7 principles of Catholic social teaching. Right now I'm handing you the sheet, and it says for children at the top, but the reason I wanted to give this to you is because sometimes by the time you get something that kids can understand, it's the easiest for the adults as well, right? And I'll hand you in a minute paragraphs about each one of these. But you can see there, in poster format as well as in simple wording, and by the way, the Spanish is on the other side if you want to use this. But it's like the 7 principles that the Catholic bishops adopted on this. And then here comes the English version for adults. And the best thing about this is the titles that weren't put on the kids' version. But you can see there the 7 principles of Catholic social teaching. Now this was come up with in the U.S. So in some senses, it's universal, but in some senses what got emphasized came a little bit from both location and timing. So workers' rights is in there, you know, and it's still very key today, but there are other things that other people might emphasize more. Does that make sense? And still with how we apply this to very concrete situations, very concrete movement of the church's social mission. We're going to be delving into that a lot. I want you to take just a few minutes to look over, a couple of minutes, to look over those papers, and then let's take it from there, okay? And as you look it over, I want you to take a look at, does this resonate with you about right relationship with others and with the earth and with God? Are you good? Okay. And by the way, on the table back over here, we have the Spanish, the version in Spanish of the adult thing. You know how I said with the kids, English one side, Spanish the other? The paragraphs that write the stuff in English, yeah, I mean, you know, it takes both sides of the paper just to get that out. And so we had to go with another sheet to get the Spanish. If you work with people who work in Spanish, you might want to grab that paper and provide that for them, okay? So we have the principles right there for the church's social mission. What I want to do right now is, well, there's one more thing I need to do, but I want to see, does that sit okay with you? We've clipped through 4,000 years of history, including the development of wisdom about the church's social outreach, to the point that we were able to name some principles together. A little bit that I want to say about that is, since that was created, the church in the U.S. has been struggling, and by the way, other countries took ours and said, thank you, you know, and we're naming some of their own, you know, also, but I mean, this is very solid. And folks continue to address individual realities about our world today, and as they do that, they apply these principles. So the principles aren't there to, I mean, typical in a formation class, we memorize 7 principles, we can't find social teaching, you know, and it's like we don't need to just memorize them, we need to apply them. We need to take on the responsibility of being adult enough to apply this stuff. And again, knowing that we goof up sometimes, that we're gonna do it less well sometimes, but really, really well in others. Claim that history, because that's how we learn. We have to talk together about how to do that. And, you know, an obvious example right now is the tendency some people have to say the first of these principles is the only one that matters. And we've goofed up that conversation so very badly. And we need that principle. We do. And so we are now at the space as a community where we're saying we apply that totally across the board. We respect human dignity and life. From the womb to the tomb and everything in between. And that has results about how we talk and about how we approach everything from prisoners locked up in jails, heading for the death chamber to sick in beds that are looking at the end of their life and what we do and how we help them. And even, okay, you know, right now in Yemen, a ton of people starved to death. I am glad that we woke up at the murder of a journalist and all that meant.
Yeah, hope we woke up enough.
But
Yeah.
the question has been laid before all of US, and rightly so. Why did it take that when thousands and thousands had been starved out by blockade? Thanks to us, in part. And it's like all of that is part of questions of human life and dignity.
What blockade?
And we have to allow, Yemen. So it's like how, you know, and that's not the only one. I mean, we've got a ton. So it's like we are embedded in a world that has controversial issues. These can be guideposts, but we have yet to develop the wisdom around it. We're getting there. We have bits of wisdom. We need to claim the wisdom when it shows up and go with it. And we need to try to avoid taking an easy out. An immediate one-path answer is never the way. And we need to, and at the same time, we have to be so clearly committed that we move together as a community. In our witness, and in our response that's both immediate, one-on-one, and institutionalized. That's who we are as church. It is not easy. But we are gifted as a church with more than principles. It's incredible, and we really underrate this gift, seriously, and to our own peril. We underrate the structure of the church for its social mission. And that's what I'm going to take a few minutes to talk with you about right now. The structure of the church for its social mission. It is not a separate structure, exactly. It is, but it's not. The church is church. The church is hierarchical. And as U.S. born and breds, sometimes we have trouble with hierarchy. And that's okay. That's ours to work out. But I guarantee you it is a gift in the terms of the church's social mission. Why?
Structure.
Structure is important. And I'm going to give you the structure and then we'll talk about it. So, you know how we talked about the love that focuses on the other? And that's the basis of everything we've been talking about? The word for that form of love is caritas. Now you probably already know both Hebrew scriptures and Greek scriptures from the New Testament have multiple words for love, depending on what they were focusing on. Brotherly love, or the love that is life sacrifice, or what was it? Caritas is a Latin word. It's a word in Latin. But it's the word that the church is kind of glommed onto the most when it talks about its own social mission. Caritas, the love that focuses on the other. And that's important because, quite frankly, we have a lot of love going on that doesn't focus on the other. And, you know, it's like we need to get beyond that and really practice the love that focuses on the other in a complete and holistic way and in a sustainable way. And that's what the church's social mission is about. The word caritas in Latin, in papal encyclicals, is sometimes translated love and sometimes translated charity. And you can see why when what they mean is love that focuses on the other. But I've seen it literally translated with either of those words in the same paragraph or even in the same sentence. And it's because we haven't got a good word in English that captures it. So anytime you see love or charity, let it click in your mind, they're probably talking about the characteristic of a love with the characteristic that it focuses on the other. So you're going outside of yourself. You will put first that person's needs and dreams and hopes, and that's the love that we're called to. That we're engaged in a love that gets us out of ourselves, and really, our service isn't a sacrifice, it is a fulfillment. It's a fulfillment that we're compelled to by our focus on the other. You can do things when you focus on other people that you just can't do as long as your focus is on yourself. You know? It's a reorientation that really becomes compelling. And then our wisdom growth is around how do we do that smartly, wisely, and sustainably. Okay? So the structure of the Church for Social Mission is called Caritas Internationalis. Yeah, you got the word, international. So it's that international, you know, and that's a network. That's a formal network the church has, and Pope Paul, Benedict, again, wrote a document shortly before he retired, in which he said, look, every diocese is to have its Caritas agency, and every parish is to have its Caritas agency. Actively.
Oops.
Okay, we get that. The thing is, we do have it. It's a matter of activating it well. And I'll give you an example. All around the world, in most dioceses, they have the name Caritas and then they use the name of their country. Now they may have their own diocesan name as well, but they'll associate, like there's how many? 8 dioceses in Honduras, I think. I think it's 8. And they'll all identify as Caritas Honduras. Okay, that's Latin America. Now, over here in Vietnam, again, a bunch of dioceses in that country, they'll all identify as Caritas Vietnam. Okay, over here, we're in Malawi, and a bunch of dioceses that all identify as Caritas Malawi.
That's exactly what I'm looking at. Yeah, like,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, and the thing is, for us in the US, and for other very developed countries in the world, the skill set needed for what remains inside the diocese is so distinct from our ability to outreach all around the world. It's 2 totally different skill sets. Why? Infrastructure. We got a ton of infrastructure here that we take for granted. It's not over there, and it makes all the difference in the world about how you work over there. So, we've got our 2 agencies instead of just 1, and we don't use the word Caritas. Inside the country, for the work inside the country, it's in your diocese, Catholic Community Services. For outreach overseas, it's CRS, Catholic Relief Services. Now, just to let you know, because if you do stuff on the net like you were just doing, Caritas Community Services is a term used by a few dioceses. Most dioceses in the U.S. use the term Catholic Charities. And so you have Catholic Charities USA. And it's its own 501c3. And there's a lot of history behind that. But it's like, there's service within. But there's also this tremendous service we're able to do in Malawi, in Vietnam, in Honduras. We're one of the most, Catholic Relief Services, one of the most respected international humanitarian agencies in the world. Others come to us to copy from us, and we gladly share our processes and all of that. Why are we so effective? Because of our partners. Because we're part of that church's structure. We go in, we get to sidestep a lot of graft, a lot of corruption, and a lot of ignorance, quite frankly, because of our partner there on the ground who can tell us what the people need most and how to help